Our family vacation was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to reconnect after a long year of work and endless responsibilities. Charlotte and I had been married for nearly 10 years, and while things weren't perfect, I thought we were in a good place. We had our ups and downs, just like any other couple, but we had two beautiful kids, and I believed we were solid. I loved her, and she loved me. Or at least, that's what I told myself. It was Charlotte's idea to go to Hawaii. She'd been dropping hints about needing a getaway for months, and honestly, I was on board. With my job keeping me late at the office more often than not, I figured it would be the perfect opportunity to hit the reset button. I'd even started planning some surprise activities for just the two of us. Beach dinners, maybe a hike through the jungle, things to reignite the connection that had felt a little distant recently. I didn't notice the red flags right away. They were there, I realize now, like tiny cracks in the foundation that I overlooked. Hindsight is always 20/20ths, but at the time, I thought the distance between us was just normal marriage stuff. People get busy, life gets in the way. I thought we'd work through it, that this vacation would help us get back to where we used to be. But Charlotte had other plans. We were flying out of LAX, a 6-hour flight to Honolulu. The kids were buzzing with excitement, and honestly, so was I. I'd been looking forward to this break for weeks, counting down the days until I could leave work behind and focus on my family. Charlotte, though, seemed distracted. She was glued to her phone, typing quickly with a slight frown on her face. I asked her if everything was okay, and she flashed me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just work stuff," she said, slipping her phone into airplane mode as we boarded the plane. "I'll be fine once we get there." I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was always stressed with work, managing the household, and taking care of the kids. Charlotte was a fantastic mother, and I trusted her completely. I didn't think twice when she kept checking her phone before takeoff. I figured she was tying up loose ends before going off the grid for a week. We had the perfect setup on the plane. Charlotte by the window, me in the middle, and Ava and Logan in the row in front of us, already glued to their iPads. The plane started taxiing down the runway, and I reached for Charlotte's hand. She gave it a squeeze, but I noticed her attention was drifting out the window, her mind somewhere else entirely. Again, I chalked it up to nerves. She never liked flying. She was probably just anxious about the trip, right? At least, that's what I told myself. The first couple of hours of the flight passed uneventfully. The kids were entertained with movies and games, and I was flipping through the in-flight magazine, trying to distract myself from the cramped seat. Charlotte barely said a word. She was staring out the window most of the time, occasionally checking her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. But I didn't think much of it. I figured she'd relax once we landed in Hawaii and the vacation really began. At one point, I got up to stretch my legs and check on the kids. When I returned, I noticed a man across the aisle from us watching Charlotte. He was tall, with sandy blonde hair and a casual, confident air about him. He looked like the type of guy who spent his life on the beach, all tan skin and relaxed muscles. I didn't pay him much attention at first, but I did notice that when I sat back down, Charlotte seemed to stiffen slightly. "Everything okay?" I asked, leaning toward her. She smiled again, that same quick, strained smile. "Yeah, just tired." I didn't push. I figured she was just trying to decompress. I reached over, took her hand again, and told her to get some rest. She nodded but didn't close her eyes. The man across the aisle caught my eye once or twice throughout the flight, but again, I didn't think much of it. He was just another passenger, probably headed to Hawaii for his own vacation. I had no reason to think otherwise. When we finally landed, the kids were bouncing in their seats, eager to get off the plane and see the beach. We gathered our bags, and as we filed off the plane, I noticed the same guy trailing a little too close behind us. He wasn't rude or invasive, just there. Again, I shrugged it off. The flight was full of tourists. It wasn't unusual for people to head to the same destination, right? We arrived at the resort that evening, the sun already beginning to set over the ocean. The kids were exhausted from the long day of travel, and Charlotte seemed on edge, but I figured it was just the stress of getting everything organized. I had rented a suite overlooking the beach, hoping it would be the perfect place for us to unwind and spend some time together. The first few days of the trip went by in a blur of beaches, poolside drinks, and excursions with the kids. We snorkeled, we hiked, we explored the island. Charlotte was present, but she wasn't really there. She'd smile for the family photos, laugh at the kids' jokes, but something about her felt distant. She kept checking her phone when she thought I wasn't looking, and there were times when she would wander off, saying she needed some me time to recharge. I didn't question it. We've been married for 10 years. People need their space. But what I didn't realize was that while I was swimming with the kids or grabbing ice cream, she was slipping away to meet someone else. There was one night in particular that stands out to me now. The kids were asleep, and I suggested we go for a late-night walk on the beach, just the two of us. She hesitated, saying she was too tired, but urged me to go without her, insisting I needed a break. I should have known something was wrong then. I should have seen the signs. But I was blind, too caught up in the idea of giving her space, of trusting her to unwind however she needed. I took a long walk down the beach that night, enjoying the sound of the waves and the quiet that comes when you're far from home. I didn't know it at the time, but while I was lost in my own thoughts, Charlotte was meeting someone else, someone who had been right under my nose the entire time. The next morning, we were at breakfast when I saw him again. The same guy from the plane. He was sitting a few tables away, sunglasses perched on his head, smiling at something on his phone. I didn't put two and two together at the time, but I noticed how Charlotte's mood seemed to change whenever we saw him around. She became fidgety, distracted, her eyes darting toward him before quickly looking away. It was like she was trying too hard to act casual, too hard to avoid making eye contact with him. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she was just uncomfortable being around strangers on vacation, or maybe she was feeling self-conscious. I didn't think anything of the man. He was just another tourist, right? But now, thinking back, I realize he was always there. At the beach, at the pool, at the restaurants. Everywhere we went, he seemed to be nearby. By the time the trip was coming to an end, I was starting to feel the strain. I hadn't been able to connect with Charlotte the way I had hoped. We had moments, sure, quiet dinners, shared laughs over the kids' antics, but something about her felt absent. I chalked it up to exhaustion, figuring we'd talk more once we got back home and the kids were back in school. I was too focused on the family aspect of the vacation to realize that the man I'd seen on the plane had been more than just a random face in the crowd. The flight home was quiet. The kids were tired, and Charlotte spent most of the time staring out the window again, lost in her own world. I didn't ask any questions. I figured she was just sad that the vacation was over, that we were heading back to reality. She was never good with goodbyes. When we landed, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. It had been a good trip, but something about it had felt off, like there was a wall between Charlotte and me that I couldn't quite break through. I told myself that once we were home, once we settled back into our routine, things would go back to normal. But normal was the last thing I'd find waiting for me. It wasn't until the day after we returned that I found the messages. I was unpacking our bags when I saw her phone lying on the bed, the screen lighting up with a notification. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. Charlotte and I never snooped through each other's phones. We trusted each other. But something made me pick it up. Maybe it was the distance I'd felt from her during the trip, or maybe it was just a gut feeling I couldn't ignore. The message wasn't from anyone I recognized. Just a number, no name attached. And the text was short, but it made my stomach drop. Miss you already. Can't wait for the next time. I stood there, phone in hand, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. Who could it be? My mind raced with possibilities, but deep down, I knew. I didn't want to believe it, but the truth was staring me in the face. My heart pounded as I opened the message thread, praying it was just some misunderstanding. It wasn't. The messages were explicit, intimate. They went back weeks, maybe longer. Photos of them together, little inside jokes, comments that made my skin crawl. It was him, the man from the plane. The man who had been hovering around us the entire trip, watching us, watching her. The man I had barely noticed, but who had been right there the whole time. I felt sick. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the messages, each one more damning than the last. They had been meeting up while we were on vacation, sneaking away while I was distracted with the kids. Every time I thought Charlotte was just taking a moment to herself, she had been with him. I dropped the phone, my mind spinning. How had I missed this? How had I been so blind? The woman I loved, the mother of my children, had been lying to me for weeks, maybe months, and I hadn't seen it. I hadn't wanted to see it. When I confronted her later that night, I was shaking with rage. She knew right away what I had found. There was no point in denying it, no point in lying. The guilt was written all over her face. Charlotte froze the moment I mentioned the messages. Her face went pale, and her lips parted like she was about to say something, but no words came out. She just stood there, wide-eyed, like a deer caught in headlights. I could feel my pulse in my throat, the anger, the betrayal, all of it rising inside me like a tidal wave that I couldn't control. Say something, I snapped, my voice cracking as I threw her phone down onto the bed. Don't just stand there. Say something. She blinked, her hands trembling as she reached for the phone, but she didn't pick it up. Instead, she looked at me with this strange mix of fear and shame, and I hated that part of me. A small, stupid part. Felt bad for her in that moment. The woman I'd spent a decade with, who I thought I'd grow old with, was standing there guilty as sin, and yet there was still that nagging feeling in the back of my head that wanted to protect her. I didn't mean for this to happen, she whispered finally, her voice so quiet that I almost missed it. I stared at her, disbelief flooding through me. Didn't mean for what to happen, Charlotte? The affair? The sneaking around? Or did you just not mean for me to find out? Her breath hitched, and she finally sank onto the edge of the bed, burying her face in her hands. I don't know, she muttered through her fingers. I don't know how it got this far. That's your answer? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My hands were shaking, my voice rising with every word. You don't know how it got this far? You've been lying to me for God knows how long, sneaking around with him right under my nose, during our family vacation, and that's all you can say? I'm sorry, she whispered again, and I could hear the tears in her voice, but it didn't move me. Not this time. Sorry? I laughed bitterly, pacing the room now, my hands clenched into fists. You're sorry? How the hell do you expect me to believe that, Charlotte? You spent the whole trip pretending like everything was fine, like we were just some happy family, while you were sneaking off to be with him behind my back. She didn't respond, just kept her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed quietly. I didn't care. I couldn't care. The rage boiling inside me was too much, too overwhelming. I had spent an entire week trying to make things work, trying to get close to her, and the entire time, she had been with him. The room felt too small, too suffocating. I had to get out, had to clear my head before I said something I couldn't take back. I grabbed my keys off the dresser and turned toward the door, not even bothering to look at her. I need to get out of here, I muttered, more to myself than to her. Jason, wait, she choked out, standing up suddenly, her eyes red and swollen. Please don't go. Let's talk about this. I stopped, my hand on the doorknob, my chest heaving with the effort of trying to control my anger. There's nothing to talk about, I said through gritted teeth. You cheated on me, Charlotte. You lied to me. You broke us. She took a shaky step toward me, her hands outstretched like she wanted to close the distance between us, but I stepped back, holding up a hand to stop her. I couldn't bear to have her near me right now. I couldn't stand the thought of her touching me. I didn't want this to happen, she said again, her voice pleading now. I didn't mean to hurt you, Jason. I was lost. Lost? I spat, turning to face her fully now, my eyes narrowing. That's your excuse? You were lost? So what? You just decided to screw some random guy to find yourself? Her face crumpled, but I didn't care. I was too far gone. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal. It was all too much, too raw. He wasn't random, she whispered, her voice barely audible. My stomach twisted at her words, a fresh wave of nausea washing over me. I knew what she was saying before she even said it, but I needed to hear it. I needed to hear the full truth, no matter how much it hurt. How long? I asked, my voice low, dangerously calm. How long has this been going on? Charlotte hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. A few months. I laughed bitterly, running a hand through my hair. A few months? So all this time, While I thought we were just going through a rough patch, you were screwing some guy behind my back. It wasn't like that, she said quickly, shaking her head. It wasn't just about sex. Oh, that makes it better, I snapped. What, you're in love with him? Is that it? Her face contorted, and she shook her head, her tears falling faster now. No, I'm not in love with him, Jason. I don't love him. Then why? My voice cracked, the anger starting to give way to something deeper, something more painful. Why did you do this to us? To our family? She wiped her eyes, her shoulders slumped in defeat. I don't know, she whispered again, her voice barely a breath. I was feeling so alone. You were always at work, always distracted, and I didn't know how to talk to you anymore. And he was there. He made me feel wanted. I stood there, staring at her, my heart breaking all over again. All this time, I had been working my ass off for us, trying to provide for my family, trying to give them the life they deserved, and Charlotte had taken that as me abandoning her, as me not wanting her. And instead of talking to me, instead of being honest, she'd gone and found comfort in someone else? I couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in, and I had to get out. I turned without another word and walked out the door, ignoring Charlotte's desperate pleas for me to stay. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't be there. Not with her. Not right now. I drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring together as I tried to wrap my head around everything. I kept replaying the conversation in my mind, over and over, like some sick loop I couldn't escape. Charlotte had cheated. She had lied. She had destroyed everything I thought we had. And the worst part? I hadn't even seen it coming. I pulled into a parking lot by the beach. Our beach, the one where we used to come every summer before things got complicated, before life got in the way. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore used to calm me, used to make everything feel okay. But tonight, the ocean felt just as unforgiving as my thoughts. I sat there in the car, staring out at the dark water, my hands still gripping the steering wheel tightly. How had it come to this? How had my life fallen apart so completely? I kept trying to piece together the last few months, trying to see the moments when things had shifted, but I couldn't find any clear answers. I had missed the signs, all of them, and now I was paying the price. I thought about the kids, about Ava and Logan. They didn't know. They didn't have any idea what was happening, and I wasn't sure how I was supposed to explain it to them. How do you tell your children that their mother had betrayed you? That the life they thought was so perfect was built on lies? I leaned my head back against the seat, closing my eyes, the exhaustion hitting me all at once. I had no idea what to do next. I couldn't stay with Charlotte, not after this. But the thought of tearing our family apart, of losing my kids in the process, made me feel physically sick. At some point, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, the sun was starting to rise, casting a pale light over the ocean. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, and I groggily reached for it, my heart pounding in my chest when I saw Charlotte's name on the screen. Jason, please come home. We need to talk. I stared at the message for a long time, my mind racing. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to hear her excuses or her apologies. But I knew I couldn't avoid this forever. I had to face her. I had to figure out what the hell was going to happen next. With a heavy sigh, I started the car and drove back home, my stomach churning with dread. When I walked through the front door, Charlotte was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes red and swollen from crying. The kids were at school, thank God, so we didn't have to worry about keeping up appearances. I stood in the doorway, not sure if I should sit down or keep my distance. Jason, please, she started, her voice hoarse from the crying. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But can we please try to talk about this? I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. What's there to talk about, Charlotte? You cheated. You lied. You made a mockery of our marriage. I know, she said quickly, her voice cracking. I know, but I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose our family. Can we figure out how to fix this? Fix this? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You want to fix this? She nodded, wiping her eyes. I do. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I'll go to counseling. I'll do anything, Jason. Please, just give me a chance. I shook my head, the anger and disbelief swirling inside me. How do you expect me to just forgive you for this? How do you expect me to ever trust you again, knowing what you did, knowing that you chose him over me, over us? She stood up, her eyes desperate as she stepped toward me. I didn't choose him. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but I never stopped loving you, Jason. I never stopped wanting us. I stepped back, the space between us feeling like a chasm that couldn't be crossed. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this, Charlotte. Her face crumpled again, her tears falling freely now. I know, but I want to make it right. Please, I'm begging you. I stood there, staring at her, my heart heavy with the weight of everything. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that we could fix this, that we could somehow find a way back to what we used to have. But deep down, I knew the truth. The trust was broken, and without trust, what do we have? I need time, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I can't decide anything right now. She nodded, wiping her tears, her face filled with a fragile kind of hope. Okay, take as much time as you need. I'll wait. I'll do whatever you need me to do. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there in the wreckage of our life. The next few days were a blur. I stayed at Mike's place, needing space to think, to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. Mike, my best friend since college, didn't ask questions. He knew something was wrong. He could read it all over my face, but he didn't push. He just let me crash on his couch, gave me a beer, and let me brood in silence. Eventually, though, I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to make a decision. I had to figure out if I was willing to try and make things work with Charlotte, or if it was time to walk away. Part of me hated the idea of giving up on our marriage. We had been together for so long, built a life together, had 2 beautiful kids. But the other part of me, the part that had seen those messages, the part that had been gutted by her betrayal, knew that things could never be the same again. After a few days at Mike's place, the weight of the situation began to press on me from all sides. I had told Charlotte I needed time, but even with that space, nothing felt clearer. The confusion, the anger, the betrayal. It all sat inside me like a heavy stone, refusing to shift no matter how much I tried to process it. Mike had been good about giving me space, but on the 3rd night, he finally spoke up. We were sitting on his back porch, beers in hand, staring out at his yard lit by the dim glow of the porch light. The hum of crickets filled the silence between us. So, you gonna tell me what's going on? He asked, his voice gentle but firm. I didn't respond right away. The words were lodged in my throat. Saying it out loud made it feel even more real, and part of me was still in denial, hoping I'd wake up from this nightmare. But when I turned and saw the concern in Mike's eyes, I knew I had to talk to someone. I couldn't carry this alone anymore. She cheated, I said finally, my voice hollow. Mike's face didn't change much, but I saw the flicker of shock in his eyes. He was quiet for a moment, taking it in, then he nodded slowly, as if letting the weight of my words settle in. Damn, man, he said quietly. I'm sorry. How did you find out? I stared at the beer bottle in my hands, twisting it around nervously. Her phone. I found messages from him. It was the guy from the plane. Mike's brow furrowed. Wait, what guy? I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I hadn't even told him about the trip yet. On our vacation to Hawaii, there was this guy on the plane, sitting across the aisle from us. I didn't think much of it, but he kept showing up everywhere we went. I thought it was just a coincidence. Turns out, it wasn't. He was meeting up with her the whole time. Mike sat back in his chair, exhaling sharply. Jesus. Yeah. I took a long drink of my beer, the bitterness barely cutting through the numbness inside me. I don't know how I missed it. I was right there. The whole trip, I thought everything was fine, that we were just reconnecting as a family. But she was sneaking off to be with him behind my back. Mike shook his head, staring out into the yard. That's messed up, man. I don't even know what to say. Me neither, I muttered. I confronted her about it when we got back. She admitted everything. And now? Mike asked carefully. What are you gonna do? I shrugged, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me again. She wants to fix things. She says she's willing to go to counseling, do whatever it takes to rebuild the trust. But I don't know if I can do it, Mike. I don't know if I can ever look at her the same way. He nodded slowly, not rushing me, just letting me get it out. That's a tough call. I mean, counseling works for some people, but it's not magic. You'd have to want to do it. You'd have to really believe it can be fixed. I shook my head, feeling the frustration bubble up again. That's the thing. I don't know if it can be fixed. Every time I think about it, all I can see is the betrayal. I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust her again. Mike was quiet for a moment, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Look, man, I'm not going to tell you what to do. No one can. But I've known you a long time, and I know this. Whatever decision you make, it has to be for you. Not for her, not for the kids. It's got to be for you. Because if you go back and you're not fully in it, it's only going to make things worse. I nodded, appreciating his words even though they didn't make the decision any easier. It wasn't just about me, though. That was the problem. There were 2 kids involved, and the thought of ripping their family apart felt like a knife twisting in my gut. But how could I stay in a marriage where I was constantly questioning her, constantly wondering if she was still lying to me? I know, I said quietly, but the kids, I don't want to ruin their lives. Mike sighed. I get it, but they're stronger than you think, and staying in a toxic situation won't be any better for them. You have to do what's right for you. They'll be okay. They'll get through it. I leaned back in my chair, staring up at the night sky, my chest tight. I didn't know what was right anymore. Everything felt wrong. The life I thought I had, the future I'd envisioned with Charlotte, it was all gone. And no matter what I chose, it felt like I was going to lose something. Either my marriage or my peace of mind. I went back home the next day, feeling no closer to a decision than when I had left. I wasn't sure what I expected to find when I walked through the door. Maybe Charlotte in tears again, pleading with me to stay. Maybe more awkward silence, the kind where neither of us knows what to say or how to act. But when I walked in, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The kids were at school, and Charlotte was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she hadn't slept since the night I left. I hadn't either, to be fair. Hey, she said softly as I stepped into the room. I didn't respond right away, just set my bag down by the door and leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. The tension between us was palpable, like a thick fog we couldn't see through. I wasn't sure if you were coming back, she said after a moment, her voice trembling slightly. I shrugged. I needed time to think. She nodded, wiping her hands nervously on her jeans. And did you? I don't know, I admitted. I don't know what to think, Charlotte. Every time I try to figure out what to do, I just end up feeling lost. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry this time. She just looked at me, her face full of regret. I know I hurt you. I know I broke your trust. But Jason, I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose our family. I sighed, rubbing my temples. How am I supposed to believe that, Charlotte? How am I supposed to believe anything you say after this? I'll do whatever it takes, she said quickly, her voice desperate. I'll go to therapy, we'll go to marriage counseling. I'll give you access to my phone, whatever you need. I'll never talk to him again, I swear. Her words felt rehearsed, like she'd been practicing them for days, waiting for the moment when I'd come back so she could lay it all out. But the problem wasn't just the affair. It wasn't just the lies. It was that the trust between us had been shattered, and I didn't know if it could ever be rebuilt. I don't know if I can do it, I said, my voice low. I don't know if I can get past this. She stood up from the table, her hands shaking. Please don't say that. Please don't give up on us. We can fix this, Jason. I know we can. When I went back to the house, it was to pack my things. I had made my decision, and I couldn't drag it out any longer. Charlotte was home when I arrived, sitting on the couch with her phone in her lap, her eyes widening when she saw me walk in with an empty suitcase. "You're leaving?" she asked, her voice cracking. I nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I'm leaving." She stood up, panic flashing across her face. "No. Jason, please, don't do this. We can still fix this. We can still—" "There's nothing left to fix, Charlotte," I interrupted, my voice steady but cold. "The trust is gone. And without that, what are we?" She stared at me, her face crumpling with emotion. "We're a family." I closed my eyes, the pain of her words hitting me harder than I expected. "I know, but sometimes love isn't enough." I could see the moment the fight left her. Her shoulders slumped, her face pale and drained of hope. She knew. She had known all along, deep down, that this was how it would end. But it didn't make it any easier to watch. "Please don't take the kids from me," she whispered, her voice breaking. I shook my head. "I'm not going to do that. We'll figure something out, something that works for them. But I can't stay, Charlotte. I just can't." We stood there in the wreckage of our marriage, both of us broken in our own ways. But there was no fixing this. No going back. Too much had been destroyed. I packed my things quickly, not wanting to drag it out. Charlotte didn't try to stop me. She just sat back down on the couch, staring at the floor, tears streaming down her face. When I was done, I took one last look at her, at the life we had built together, and then I walked out the door. The next few months were a blur of lawyers, custody agreements, and difficult conversations with the kids. Ava and Logan took it hard, as I expected, but we did our best to shield them from the worst of it. Charlotte and I agreed to split custody, and for the most part, we kept things civil. I didn't hate her, not really. I just couldn't be with her anymore. There were days when the weight of everything felt unbearable, when I questioned whether I had made the right choice. But as time passed, I started to feel lighter, freer. I was no longer stuck in limbo, no longer living with the constant doubt and mistrust that had plagued me since the affair. I had let go, and though the future was uncertain, I knew one thing for sure. I had made the right choice. After I walked out of the house, the world outside felt oddly still, like everything had paused for a moment to let me catch my breath. But nothing inside me felt still. I was a mess, a knot of conflicting emotions. Relief, sadness, anger, and guilt all swirled together, making it impossible to feel any one thing clearly. I had spent weeks agonizing over what to do, and now that I had made the decision, it still didn't feel real. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, unable to move. The house behind me was quiet, the same house where we had celebrated birthdays, raised our kids, and built a life. And now, I was leaving it all behind. It was the right decision. I knew that, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me out of my daze. It was a text from Mike. "You good?" I let out a slow breath and typed back. "Yeah, just packed my stuff. It's done." He replied almost immediately. "Come by if you need to talk." I stared at the screen for a moment, considering it. Mike had been my rock through all of this, but right now, I didn't feel like talking. I just needed to be alone, to let the weight of the situation sink in. "Thanks. I think I just need some space tonight." He understood. He always did. His reply was simple. "Anytime." I put my phone down and finally started the car, pulling away from the house that had been my home for so many years. It didn't feel like home anymore. Nothing did. The weeks that followed were the hardest I'd ever faced. The legal process was brutal, draining me emotionally and financially. I thought the worst was over after walking out, but the reality of separation hit hard. Custody arrangements, dividing our assets, dealing with lawyers. It was like reliving the pain over and over again. Every form and document a reminder of what had been lost. Charlotte and I tried to keep things civil, especially when it came to the kids. I hated what this was doing to them. Ava and Logan were too young to fully understand why their parents weren't together anymore, but they could sense that things weren't right. Ava would ask questions, her big blue eyes filled with confusion. "Why can't we all live together like we used to?" Logan, being younger, didn't ask as many questions, but he started having nightmares. I'd hear him calling for me from his room when they stayed with me, and I'd rush in, finding him tangled in his blankets, tears streaming down his cheeks. I wanted to tell them everything would be okay, but that felt like a lie. Nothing about this situation felt okay. One day, about a month after I moved out, I was at work when I got a call from my lawyer. We were finally nearing the end of the divorce proceedings. The property division was settled, the custody agreement was almost finalized, and soon, I'd be free of the legal ties that bound me to Charlotte. The lawyer was explaining something about the final paperwork when I zoned out, the weight of it all suddenly hitting me. This was really happening. I was really getting divorced. I had spent so long trying to hold my family together, trying to make things work, that I hadn't fully processed the fact that it was all falling apart. And now, there was no turning back. I signed the papers 2 weeks later, sitting in the sterile office of my attorney, the pen shaking slightly in my hand. Charlotte had already signed. She wasn't there in person, which made it easier, but the emptiness I felt as I scrawled my name across the last page was unbearable. When I left the office that day, it was done. I was officially a divorced man. Life after the divorce felt like stepping into a fog. I was going through the motions, work, taking care of the kids when it was my turn, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But nothing felt normal. It was as if I was living someone else's life, someone else's version of me. The version of me that was supposed to grow old with Charlotte, to celebrate our kids' milestones together, was gone. There were nights when I'd sit in my apartment, the silence closing in around me, and I'd wonder if I'd made a mistake. Maybe I should have tried harder to fix things, to make it work. Maybe I should have gone to counseling like Charlotte had begged me to. But then I'd remember the messages I had found, the lies, the betrayal, and the doubts would fade, replaced by a simmering anger. There was no going back. What was broken couldn't be repaired. I threw myself into work. It was the only thing that made me feel like I had any control left. The more I worked, the less time I had to think. I started picking up extra shifts, staying late at the office, anything to avoid going home to the empty apartment. It wasn't the healthiest coping mechanism, but it was all I had. Mike checked in on me regularly, trying to get me to go out, to blow off some steam, but I wasn't interested. Socializing felt like a chore, and I wasn't ready to deal with people asking about the divorce. Everyone had questions. They always do when a marriage falls apart, but I didn't have any answers. Not the ones they wanted to hear, anyway. A few months after the divorce was finalized, I was at a work event when I ran into an old friend from college. Her name was Sarah, and she had been part of our friend group back in the day. We hadn't kept in touch over the years, but when she spotted me across the room, she waved and made her way over, her smile warm and familiar. "Jason? Oh my God, it's been forever." I forced a smile, trying to summon some enthusiasm. "Hey, Sarah. Yeah, it's been a while." We made small talk for a few minutes, catching up on what had been going on in each other's lives. I found out she had just moved back to the city after living out of state for a few years. She asked about Charlotte, and for a moment, I hesitated, not sure how much I wanted to share. We're not together anymore," I said finally, keeping my tone as casual as possible. Her face softened with sympathy. "I'm sorry to hear that. I didn't know." "It's okay," I lied. "It's been a tough year, but, life goes on." She nodded, giving me a reassuring smile. "Yeah, I get that. Life has a funny way of moving forward, even when you're not ready." We talked for a while longer, and for the first time in months, I felt a little lighter. Sarah was easy to talk to, and there wasn't any of the awkwardness or pity I had come to expect when people found out about the divorce. By the end of the night, we had exchanged numbers, promising to grab coffee sometime. In the weeks that followed, Sarah and I texted a few times, and eventually, we made plans to meet for coffee. I was nervous at first, unsure if I was ready to spend time with someone who wasn't Charlotte. It felt strange, sitting across from another woman, having a conversation that wasn't tinged with the weight of the past. But Sarah was easygoing, and she didn't push. She didn't ask for details about the divorce or try to dig into my personal life. She just talked about her new job, her experiences living out of state, the crazy things that had happened since we'd last seen each other. It was refreshing. Over time, we started seeing each other more regularly. We weren't dating, not really. It was more like two old friends reconnecting after a long time apart. But there was something comfortable about it, something that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, I could move forward. It wasn't until about 6 months after the divorce that I started to feel like myself again. The fog had lifted, and while the pain of the betrayal still lingered, it wasn't all-consuming anymore. I had found a new rhythm, a new sense of normal. My relationship with the kids had gotten stronger, too. I made sure to be present for them, to be the father they needed during this difficult transition. They still struggled with the separation, but we were getting through it together. Charlotte and I communicated only when necessary, mostly about the kids. She had tried to reach out a few times, suggesting we talk, but I shut it down. I wasn't interested in rehashing old wounds. Whatever closure I needed, I had found it on my own. One day, as I was driving Ava and Logan home after a weekend with me, Ava turned to me from the back seat, her expression serious. "Dad, are you and Mom ever going to get back together?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't expected it, and I wasn't sure how to answer. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, then at Logan, who was listening quietly, his wide eyes waiting for my response. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "No, sweetie. Your mom and I aren't going to get back together. But that doesn't mean we don't love you both very much." Ava frowned, her little brow furrowing in confusion. "But why? Why can't we all live together again?" I felt the familiar ache in my chest, the one that came every time I thought about what the divorce was doing to them. Sometimes, grown-ups have problems that are hard to fix. But I promise you, your mom and I will always be here for you, no matter what. She didn't look satisfied with the answer, but she nodded slowly, sinking back into her seat. Logan stayed quiet, his little mind probably trying to make sense of everything. When we got to Charlotte's house, I walked them to the door, giving them both hugs before they went inside. Charlotte opened the door, her eyes meeting mine for a brief moment. We didn't say much, just the usual exchange about their schedules for the week. But there was something different in her expression, something that looked like acceptance. We were both moving on. Months passed, and the new normal settled in. The pain of the past was still there, but it had faded into the background, no longer the defining feature of my life. I focused on my kids, my work, and my own healing, and for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. One evening, Sarah and I were sitting on my couch, watching some ridiculous movie on Netflix, when she turned to me, a soft smile on her face. "You seem different lately," she said, her voice warm. "Lighter." I thought about it for a moment, realizing she was right. The weight I had carried for so long was gone. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't stuck in the past, reliving the betrayal over and over. I had finally let go. "Yeah," I said, smiling back at her. "I think I am." Sarah leaned against my shoulder, and for the first time since my world had fallen apart, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Even though I had found a sense of peace, life wasn't suddenly perfect. There were still moments when the weight of everything that had happened crept back in. The late nights when the apartment felt too quiet, when I'd hear a song on the radio that reminded me of a time when Charlotte and I were still in love, or when I'd see a family together, laughing and happy, and I'd be reminded of what I thought my life would always be. But those moments were fleeting now. They didn't consume me the way they once had. They were just that, moments, not the entire story. My relationship with Sarah had deepened, slowly and naturally, in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't dramatic or rushed, just two people who enjoyed each other's company, slowly finding comfort in one another. We still hadn't put any labels on what we were doing. That part didn't feel important yet. What mattered was that being with her felt easy, like a weight had been lifted whenever she was around. The kids had taken to her too. At first, I was careful not to introduce her into their lives too quickly. I wasn't sure how they'd react to seeing me with someone who wasn't their mom, but Sarah had a way with them. She was gentle, playful, never trying too hard to make them like her. Ava loved her almost immediately, charmed by the way Sarah could braid her hair better than I could and how she always had funny stories to share. Logan took a little longer, but soon enough, he was joining in on the games and laughter whenever she was around. One Saturday, we were at the park, just the four of us, sitting by the playground while Ava and Logan played. The sun was bright, casting a golden glow over everything, and Sarah leaned into me as we watched the kids running around, their laughter filling the air. It felt like a scene from a different life, one where everything was simple again, where I didn't carry the scars of betrayal so close to the surface. "You ever think about what's next?" she asked suddenly, her voice soft but curious. I turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She shrugged, her eyes still on the kids. "I don't know. Just where this is going. With us, I mean." I wasn't sure how to answer at first. I hadn't thought much about the future in a concrete way. For so long, I'd been focused on just getting through the day, on putting one foot in front of the other. But with Sarah, it was different. She made me think about what came next, about the possibilities that lay ahead instead of the pain behind me. "I like where we are now," I said honestly. "But yeah, I guess I've thought about it." She smiled, leaning her head on my shoulder. "Me too." And just like that, the conversation didn't feel heavy or rushed. It wasn't about figuring everything out all at once. It was about being present in the moment, about letting things unfold naturally. And that was something I had learned to appreciate in the months since the divorce. I didn't need to have all the answers. I didn't need to control everything. Sometimes, letting things happen at their own pace was enough. A few weeks later, I found myself standing in front of Charlotte's house, waiting for the kids to come out. It was one of our usual handoff days. Every other weekend, they stayed with me, and we'd gotten into a decent routine. Charlotte and I didn't talk much beyond logistics, and that was fine with me. We were co-parents now, and that was all we needed to be. But this time, as she opened the door and the kids ran out to greet me, I noticed something different about her. She seemed lighter, almost like the version of Charlotte I had known before everything went wrong. Her smile was softer, less strained. She looked at me for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to say something, and then she spoke. "Jason, can we talk for a second?" I blinked, surprised. "Sure. What's up?" She glanced at the kids, who were already buckling themselves into the car, then stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind her. For a moment, she looked unsure, like she was trying to find the right words. I stood there, arms crossed, waiting. I wanted to apologize," she said finally, her voice low but steady. I frowned, not sure where this was coming from. "Apologize?" "For everything," she continued, meeting my eyes. "For the way I hurt you. For the affair. I've been thinking a lot about it lately, and I know I never really gave you the apology you deserved." I didn't know how to respond. I'd spent so long waiting for this moment, for her to acknowledge what she had done, to apologize in a way that felt real. And now that it was happening, I didn't feel the surge of relief I thought I would. Instead, I felt tired. "You don't have to apologize, Charlotte," I said after a moment. "It's in the past. We've moved on." She shook her head. "No, I do. I need to. I was selfish, and I let my own issues get in the way of our marriage. And I know there's no excuse for what I did, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. I've been working through some things in therapy, and I've realized how much damage I caused." Her words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I should respond or just let it be. But then I sighed, feeling some of the weight of the past few years lift, just a little. "I appreciate that," I said finally. "I really do. But it's done now. We've both moved on, and that's what matters." She nodded, her expression softening. "Yeah, I guess we have. I'm glad you're doing better. And I'm happy that the kids have you, and Sarah, too. They seem really happy." The mention of Sarah caught me off guard, but I nodded. "Yeah, they like her." Charlotte smiled faintly, but it wasn't forced this time. It felt genuine. "That's good." We stood there for another moment, the silence between us no longer uncomfortable, just different. It felt like the final chapter of something I'd been holding onto for too long. And as I turned to leave, I realized that I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't holding on to the hurt. I was free. The months rolled by, and my life with Sarah and the kids began to feel more and more natural. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was good. And that was enough for me. Ava and Logan were adjusting well to the shared custody arrangement, and every day felt a little brighter, a little easier. One evening, while Sarah and I were sitting on the couch, she turned to me with a playful smile. So, I was thinking, she began, her tone teasing. I raised an eyebrow, setting down the remote. About what? About us. About maybe taking a trip? I blinked, surprised. A trip? Yeah, she said, her smile growing. Just the two of us. We've been so focused on everything else, work, the kids, life in general, that I think we deserve a little break. I hesitated for a moment, the thought of another trip, after everything that had happened, feeling a little daunting. But then I looked at Sarah, at the way her eyes lit up with excitement, and I realized something important. This wasn't the past. This was the future, and I was ready to embrace it. Yeah, I said, grinning. Let's do it. And so, a year after everything had fallen apart, I found myself standing on the edge of something new, something hopeful. The scars of the past were still there, but they didn't define me anymore. I had built something better, something stronger, with Sarah and the kids. And as we planned our future together, I realized that I had finally found what I'd been searching for all along. Peace, happiness, and above all, hope. The trip Sarah and I planned was small, just a weekend getaway up to a cabin in the mountains. But it was the first time in a long time that I had looked forward to something without reservation. It wasn't Hawaii or some tropical island, but it didn't need to be. It was our time, away from the noise, away from responsibilities, and most importantly, away from the shadows of the past. We left the kids with my parents for the weekend. They were thrilled to have them over, and it gave me peace of mind knowing they'd be well taken care of. Logan and Ava were excited for their own little adventure, not even giving me a hard time about staying behind while Sarah and I went off on our own. In fact, Ava even said, "You and Sarah deserve some fun too, Dad." Kids really are resilient. They had taken to Sarah so well, and the warmth they showed toward her made it all the more clear that this wasn't just a fleeting thing. This was real. We were building something that would last. We arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon. The air was cool and crisp, the kind of weather that makes you want to sit by a fire and never leave. The mountains stood tall around us, their peaks dusted with early snow, and the cabin itself was nestled in a grove of pine trees, isolated but inviting. I felt a calm wash over me as I stepped out of the car, stretching my arms and breathing in the fresh mountain air. Sarah came around the car and smiled at me, her eyes reflecting the same excitement I felt. "This is perfect," she said, slipping her hand into mine. "Yeah," I agreed, squeezing her hand gently. "It really is." We spent the evening settling in, making dinner together in the tiny kitchen, and laughing about how we were both terrible at following recipes. Afterward, we sat by the fireplace, wrapped in blankets, the soft crackle of the fire filling the silence between us. It was peaceful, the kind of peace I hadn't known in what felt like years. "You know," Sarah said, her voice low as she leaned against me, "I think this is the first time in a long time that I've seen you really relax." I smiled, running a hand through her hair. "It's the first time in a long time that I've felt like I could." She lifted her head to look at me, her expression soft but serious. "Do you ever regret it? The divorce, I mean. Do you ever wonder if things could have been different?" It was a question I'd asked myself 1,000 times in the months after I'd left Charlotte. But sitting there, in that moment, with Sarah beside me, I realized that the answer had finally become clear. "No," I said honestly. "I don't regret it. It was hard, and it was painful, but I think it needed to happen. I wasn't happy, and neither was she. Maybe we didn't realize it at the time, but the life we were living wasn't right for either of us." Sarah nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "I'm glad you found your way through it." "So am I," I said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "And I'm glad I found you." The rest of the weekend felt like a dream. Hiking through the woods, sitting by the fire with hot chocolate, watching the stars come out at night with Sarah nestled against me. There was something so simple, so pure about it all. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't haunted by the past. I wasn't thinking about Charlotte or the affair or the pain I had gone through. I was just there, in the moment, with Sarah, and that was enough. When we drove back home on Sunday evening, the sunset painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, I felt something new settle in my chest, a quiet kind of happiness, the kind that doesn't shout or demand attention but just exists, steady and sure. It wasn't a flashy, dramatic moment of realization. It was more of a gradual acceptance. I had been broken by what happened with Charlotte, shattered in ways I didn't think I could ever recover from. But here I was, whole again, in a way I never expected. Not just surviving, but living. Back home, life returned to its normal routine, but something inside me had shifted. I had finally moved beyond the place where I was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for something to go wrong. I wasn't holding on to old wounds anymore. Instead, I was focused on building something new, something real, with Sarah. The kids adjusted well to the rhythm of our blended family. Logan had warmed up to Sarah completely, and the bond between Ava and Sarah was growing stronger every day. There were times when I'd catch them laughing together over some inside joke, and it filled me with a sense of gratitude I couldn't quite put into words. As for Charlotte, our interactions were polite but distant. We were good co-parents, and we kept the focus on what was best for the kids. She had apologized again, more than once, and while I had accepted her apology, there wasn't a need to rekindle any kind of friendship. We had both moved on, and that was enough. One day, while I was picking up the kids from her house, Charlotte lingered in the doorway after they ran to the car. She looked at me for a long moment, then spoke, her voice quiet but sincere. "I'm glad you're doing well, Jason." I nodded, offering a small smile. "Thanks. You too." It wasn't much, but it was closure. And with that, I felt the last remnants of the weight I'd been carrying fall away. As the seasons changed and the year came to an end, Sarah and I settled into a life together that felt more and more like home. We weren't in any rush to make big changes or decisions. There was no pressure to move in together or make things official. We were just happy. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Christmas rolled around, and I spent the holiday with the kids, decorating the tree and watching old movies by the fire. Sarah joined us for dinner, and the four of us spent the evening exchanging gifts and laughter, the warmth of the season wrapping around us like a blanket. As I sat there, watching the kids tear into their presents and listening to Sarah laugh at one of Logan's jokes, I realized that I had finally found my way back to something good, something real, something that felt like home. And this time, it wasn't built on fragile foundations or half-truths. It was built on love, trust, and the knowledge that we had all come through the fire stronger than before. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready for whatever came next, because I had learned one of the hardest lessons life could teach, that sometimes the only way to truly move forward is to let go of the past. Even though life with Sarah and the kids had settled into a peaceful rhythm, a part of me still braced for something to go wrong. I didn't say it out loud, didn't let it show, but deep down, I knew that after everything I had been through, trusting that things could just stay good felt dangerous. It was the scars from Charlotte, the betrayal, the lies, the sudden gut punch of realizing that the life you thought you had was a lie. Those scars don't just fade away. They stay, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to remind you of how quickly things can fall apart. And then it happened. I was at work, about a month after Christmas, sitting at my desk and trying to power through a mountain of emails, when I got a call from Charlotte. It wasn't unusual. She'd call or text sometimes if something came up with the kids, but when I answered, I immediately knew something was off. Her voice was strained. Her words rushed. "Jason, we need to talk. In person." I frowned, leaning back in my chair. "About what? Is everything okay with the kids?" "They're fine," she said quickly, but her voice cracked a little. It's something else. Can you come over later? Please." There was a tremor in her voice I hadn't heard in a long time, and it sent a chill down my spine. I hesitated, my mind racing through possibilities, but I couldn't make sense of the tension I was hearing. "All right," I said slowly. "I'll come by after work." The rest of the day was a blur. I couldn't focus, couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was coming. My thoughts kept bouncing between Charlotte, the kids, and Sarah, wondering what could possibly be happening now, after all this time. It had been over a year since the divorce, and we had both moved on, or so I thought. When I finally pulled into Charlotte's driveway that evening, the sinking feeling in my gut only grew stronger. She was standing at the door, waiting for me, her face pale and drawn. I hadn't seen her like this since the days immediately after I'd found out about the affair, and that only made the tension worse. "Jason, thank you for coming," she said as I stepped inside, her voice shaky. I followed her into the living room, my heart pounding. She gestured for me to sit, but I stayed standing, too on edge to relax. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice tight. "You're freaking me out, Charlotte." She wrung her hands, her eyes darting toward the window before settling on me. "I don't even know how to say this. I've been going over it in my head for days, and I don't know if there's a good way to tell you. But you need to know." A knot formed in my stomach, the kind you get when you're standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way beneath you. "Just tell me," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. Charlotte took a deep breath, her eyes filling with tears. "Remember the affair? With Jake?" The name hit me like a punch to the gut, and I immediately felt the old anger rise, mixing with confusion. Of course, I remembered Jake. He was the man who had been on that plane, the man who had shattered my life. But what did he have to do with anything now? "Yeah, I remember," I said through gritted teeth. "What about him?" She swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she wiped away a tear. I ran into him a couple of months ago. It wasn't intentional. I didn't even know he was back in town. We talked, and I thought it was just going to be a quick catch-up. But then he told me something. I felt the world start to tilt. Whatever this was, it wasn't good. "What did he tell you, Charlotte?" I asked, my voice barely steady. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering herself. When she opened them again, the fear in her gaze was unmistakable. "He told me he has an STD, and that he had it when we were together." My entire body went cold. I blinked, not sure if I had heard her correctly. "What?" "I know," she said quickly, the words tumbling out now, desperate. "I know it sounds crazy, but he just found out recently and reached out to let me know. I've already been tested, and thankfully, I'm fine. But Jason, I thought, you need to know. You should get tested too." I stood there, frozen, her words ringing in my ears. An STD. She had slept with him, and now I might be dragged into it too. The room seemed to close in on me, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never meant for this to happen. I know this is the last thing you want to hear, but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't tell you." I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The weight of it hit me all at once. The betrayal, the lies, and now this. I felt sick, like the ground had been ripped out from under me all over again. I don't remember leaving her house. I barely remember driving home. Everything was a blur of anger, disbelief, and a nauseating sense of dread. I stumbled into my apartment, collapsing onto the couch, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Sarah was supposed to come over that evening. My mind raced with panic. What if I had unknowingly put her at risk? What if this mistake from my past had reached into the new life I was trying to build and destroyed it? The thought was too much to bear. My phone buzzed. It was Sarah. On my way over, should I pick up dinner? My fingers hovered over the screen, trembling. I didn't know what to say, how to even begin explaining this mess to her. How could I tell her about the possibility of an STD? Something that wasn't even my fault, but would still impact her. I typed back, my heart pounding. "Can we talk when you get here?" She replied quickly. "Of course. Everything okay?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. When Sarah walked through the door half an hour later, she took one look at me and knew something was wrong. She set the takeout bag on the counter and hurried over to me, concern written all over her face. "Jason? What happened?" I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was shake my head, my throat tight with fear and guilt. She knelt in front of me, her hands on my knees, her voice soft but insistent. "Hey, whatever it is, you can tell me." I looked into her eyes, the trust, the love, and I felt a stab of pain so deep I thought I might shatter. But I had to tell her. She deserved the truth. Taking a deep breath, I finally spoke, my voice barely a whisper. "It's about Charlotte and Jake. There's something I need to tell you." And that's how it ended. If you enjoyed this story, Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment your thoughts below.